Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you all here. Nice full room, lots of energy. It's fantastic, beautiful day. Weather's getting cooler. I am John Carlson, and I direct the Center for the Study. Now we're getting the microphone. Okay. I'm going to skip. I'm not going to repeat all that. So anyway, I'm John Carlson. I direct the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict here, and it's great to see you all and have you here. Today's lecture is supported in part by our Recovering Truth Project, which is focused on religion, journalism, and democracy in a post-truth era. And that's through a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation. This project is designed to encourage journalists, scholars, students, citizens, all of us to think about how different views or understandings of reality, different views of the world, different truth claims are animating our democratic life or affecting our democratic life. And perhaps in cases of lies and mistruths and deceptions, such ideas are undermining our democracy. So speaking of truth, we're certainly hearing a lot from political candidates on running for office these days, right? With elections just around the corner, I'm sure when it's all said and done, all of our candidates here in Arizona will be accepting the outcomes of the election, even if they lose, right? And if you believe that, I've got a bridge in Crimea to sell you. All right, before we get started, a little housekeeping. If you would, please silence your cell phones. And also, if you were looking at the rotating slides at the beginning here, you saw that we have another lecture coming up on Thursday, November 3rd, same time and place, from David Livingstone Smith. It is our annual Hart Nikachos Peace Studies lecture. The title of his lectures is Real Horror, Race, Gender, and Dehumanization, exploring the relationships among those three things, and what we might be able to do to resist and combat dehumanizing tendencies. His most recent books include Making Monsters, The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization, and On Humanity, Dehumanization, and How to Resist It. He is a philosopher, but has been described as someone who not just tries to interpret the world, but also to change it. So I hope you all will be able to join us for that event. You can always find information about upcoming events at our website and find past recordings if you've missed any of our previous events. You can follow us on our YouTube channel. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow me at John D. Carlson on Twitter and become my third or fourth follower now. We're being live streamed today. Sam is my other one. Today's event is being live streamed. So welcome to all of you out there in TV land, watching from home or from work. Get back to work, I guess. I don't know. For those joining us in person, please also stick around afterwards. We will have a short reception, and just out here. And cookies are your reward for asking, engaging in questions after the talk. As it's Fall Pledge Drive season, it's a good time for many of us to thank all of our friends and supporters, especially here our friends at the Center. It's great to see so many of you out here today, and it's also a good time to renew your support of our work or to become a friend of the Center if you're not already. We really do depend on our generous contributions from our community members, from our friends, and longstanding patrons of these public programs that are intended to enrich community life and create a shared space in which we can understand and mutually better understand ourselves and improve our communities. Okay, so on to our main event today. Our guest today is Samuel Perry. He is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Oklahoma and is a leading expert in our country right now on conservative Christianity, American politics, race, sexuality, families, and other issues related to those. His most recent books are Taking America Back for God, which he co-authored with Andrew Whitehead, as well as The Flag and the Cross. And you can see both of those up there. That's White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, CNN, NBC News, The American Conservative, The New Yorker, etc. And if you flip on a media channel or look him up online, you will see all sorts of clips and interviews of him as well as his colleagues talking about this phenomenon that is gathering quite a lot of attention these days. I want to just share with you one kind of personal note. Sam shared with me this morning a statistic that showed a very high correlation between the white Christian nationalism index and the belief that the 2020 election was stolen. It was about 80% correlation. This data point is of great interest to us here at the for those of us who are working on this Recovering Truth project. We're trying to understand why people believe things that are empirically or demonstrably untrue, for which there's overwhelming evidence contrary to what they believe. Perry's work offers a really, really important response to that question, and it's a question that we really need to think about, and that's the reason we've brought him here today to help us understand better. So in our effort to learn more, we're trying to figure out, is white Christian nationalism causational or correlational with belief in mistruth or untruths? What explains this? And even more basic to that, what is white Christian nationalism? What is this thing? And how is it related to the political challenges that democracy faces right now, to political polarization in our country? For answers to these and many other kinds of questions that are quite related to these, please join me in welcoming Samuel Perry for his talk today, Power in the Blood, How White Christian Nationalism Threatens Democracy.
Thank you. Let's see. Am I on now, Jeff? Okay. Well, thank you so much. What a great crowd. I'm so glad you are here and you're joining us today. Thank you for those who are tuning in online. A little bit of house cleaning. It occurred to me that you guys might not be able to see what I've got going on over here. I will try my best to be illustrative in my words, and if you can't see the charts that I'll show. I try to use a lot of visuals just so that people can follow along with what I'm talking about. I'm a sociologist. I'm a social scientist in particular. My background is in theology. I went to seminary. I was an evangelical minister for some time. Felt, I guess, called is the word you could use to take a different career path. And so I finished my PhD in sociology at the University of Chicago almost 10 years ago, and I've been at the University of Oklahoma ever since. And I am fascinated with the ways that American culture and Christianity and issues of race and who we are as a country and as a people, how those things correspond and define one another. And within the last 7 years, my colleagues and I have tried to study this phenomenon we call Christian nationalism. We've most recently tried to zero in on what we call white Christian nationalism. I want to emphasize, though, that where I'm coming from, though, is not as a theologian and is not as an activist or some kind of leftist propagandist who is stoking up fear about the right or conservative Christians or that kind of thing. I really want to analyze a phenomenon that is out there in the world, this whatever you want to call it. We could call it an ideology, we could call it a political strategy, we could call it an identity, and in fact, we'll call it all three of those things today. But to try to measure it, to try to assess its impact. How many people believe this thing? Where does it come from? And what is its future in the United States and in our politics? And so I just want to stress that the kind of information I want to provide is in my capacity as a social scientist. I'm not trying to scare you beyond what the data would take you. The data could be scary enough, right? So but I don't feel any need to kind of sex this up or to make it extra super scary so that you will vote a certain way or so that you will dislike a group of people. I really want to take the data that we have been collecting over the past several years and to try to give you information about this phenomenon, to try to help our concepts and understand how we define these kinds of things, and hopefully we would be all more informed as we go out into our lives and our communities, online, as we vote and make decisions about the kinds of language that politicians are using and how we can be better consumers of that information. I think that's where we are as a country, is having to be better consumers and critics of the kinds of things that we are being fed in the media. It is actually a really fascinating thing to watch the very thing that you study and have been talking about all of a sudden take off and blow up as its own language. We are watching something change and morph in real time as we see it. This is the number of, and I'll fill in some gaps later on, but this is the number of tweets referencing Christian nationalism We start over here. This was put together by my friend, political scientist Ryan Burge, who scrapes Twitter for these kinds of interesting factoids. This is starting in January, and we see it's not much conversation on Twitter about Christian nationalism. All of a sudden, something happens in June and in July that causes it to explode, this interest. I wonder what that was. Was it me? Was it my tweets? Was it my conversations? It was actually somebody else, and I'll get to that in a second. And it has gone down a little bit, but it's actually still rather high. So this conversation about Christian nationalism is still ongoing. People are referencing it. Who is referencing it, and to what end? It has become the case where Christian nationalism as a concept has become so popular that people are actually selling books with it now. Let me give you some examples. These are books that were recently released. One in 2019, Red State Christians by my friend Angela Dinker, and Sarah Paulsner, who's a fantastic journalist, in 2020 released Unholy. Notice that the subtitles, Understanding the Voters Who Elected Trump, While White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. About 2 years later, each one of them had changed their subtitles. If you can read those, now it's in reference to how a journey to white Christian nationalism and the wreckage it leaves behind. Same book. How white Christian nationalists powered the Trump presidency and devastating legacy it left behind. They didn't choose this. Their publishers have decided, you know what'll sell is if we slap Christian nationalism on these books. A friend of mine, Eric Daniel, at the University of Texas, and his co-authors, one of them, Allison Shortle, a colleague of mine at OU, recently released a book. This came out just a couple of months ago, The Everyday Crusade, Christian Nationalism in American Politics. Now, the funny thing about that is they actually never reference Christian nationalism in their book. They talk about something they call American religious exceptionalism, completely different label, but their publisher told them, you want to sell books, you call it Christian nationalism. And it has become something that is out there in the public discourse. Just last night, unfortunately, I had to miss this. I was working in a class here. Happy to do so, but I missed a conversation that went on the Family Research Council. I don't know if you are familiar with that. Led by a man named Tony Perkins. They actually had a panel to talk about the rise of the term Christian nationalism in American politics. And they had Michelle Bachmann on the roll. Tony Perkins is a lifelong activist, and several other conservative activists on that docket to talk about basically our work, to talk about how leftist sociologists are now using the term Christian nationalism to try to scare conservative Christians from voting. They actually used the word suppress. That was their language, that this is used to suppress conservative Christian votes. Is it? Is this thing a leftist slur to keep conservative Christians from voting? Or is it something more? I'd like to unpack that a little bit. So what we're going to talk about today, I'll just give you a talk outline for what we're going to do. First, we're going to define our terms. What exactly are we talking about when we mention Christian nationalism? It can actually be a little bit more diverse than just one thing, and I'll try to be clear when I'm referring to one thing or the other. We're also going to assess the threat, and I'm just going to present some data on how these attitudes, how this identity, Christian nationalism, corresponds to various outcomes that we see in our surveys. And lastly, we're going to consider some pathways forward briefly. How do we address this thing? What are I think based on the evidence, what are some smart ways to plow ahead? So first, defining our terms. What is white Christian nationalism? I think we could talk about white Christian nationalism as at least three things. First, it could be a political ideology that shapes attitudes and behaviors. This a literal belief that somebody holds, that America was founded as a Christian nation, has a special relationship with God, and therefore should always be distinctively Christian in all of its policies, identity, and sacred symbols. In our recent book, The Flag and the Cross, we try to measure this. We try to measure this ideology. We develop a list of 7 questions that both tap into 2 things that we talk about in the book. Talk about what's called the deep story of white Christian nationalism, this mythical story about our country's relationship with the Christian God, and the vision for America's pathway forward, what we ought to be as a nation moving forward. And you see these questions. We ask Americans, how much do you agree with the following statements? The ones at the bottom, the success of the United States is part of God's plan. I consider the founding documents, like the Declaration and the U.S. Constitution, to be divinely inspired. That's the deep story. And if you believe those, you believe that we have a kind of a chosenness. We have a special relationship, that God pays attention to the United States in a way that he doesn't pay attention to other nations. These other questions have more to do with the vision, what you think ought to be institutionalized in American life. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. That's pretty explicit. Right? If you strongly agree with that, you strongly believe that we ought to declare ourselves by these terms. Advocate Christian values. Should enforce a strict separation of church and state. We reverse code that so that people who disagree, we look at people, they don't want a separation of church and state, in other words. Prayer in public schools, religious symbols in public spaces, the kinds of things that are pretty rife in culture war rhetoric. Now, a question to ask: are our measures the best? This is something that we work through all the time. So, and something we want to be really honest about. As social scientists, we are not writing Bibles. We're not writing things that are just kind of true for all time and will stand the test of in 200 years. People will be using our measures. We really don't think that. We're really on the bleeding edge of trying to understand this phenomenon, and that means our measures are adjusted. We're tweaking things. We're trying to capture what is this thing that we're studying. How do we define it? How do we assess it in the general population? What are the best ways forward? We're within the first 10 years of trying to really dig into this, and so I don't necessarily think our measures are the best. We're testing different ones now, as a matter of fact. I'm waiting today. I'm hoping. I'm sorry to say we're actually waiting for a national survey to come back right now. It's going to come back any day, like any day. I was hoping to get it this morning so I could crunch some numbers really quickly and just kind of pump those out to you. But we are, with every few months, we've gotten some grant money to be able to field surveys within the general population to continue to ask questions to try to understand this phenomenon a little bit better. Why have we used the questions that we do use? Some of them are imperfect, some of them are rather vague. Maybe you would even fall into one of these categories of somebody who would say, you know, I think religious symbols in public spaces is fine. I think prayer in public schools is fine. Maybe not declare the United States a Christian nation. Where does that leave me? We use them because they have been asked for a while, right? Since the mid-2000s, some people have asked those questions on surveys, and we wanted to have continuity across time. Why? So we can see change. We're really fascinated by this idea of whether or not Christian nationalism is rising or declining. I think there's evidence to suggest it's declining in some ways and rising in others. We'll talk about that. But we have tried to use different measures that have been used previously, even if they're imperfect, so that we could establish a record, something that's changing over time. We tend to find exactly the same results, whatever measures we use. Our Christian nationalism measures, this kind of works like a grenade. Get anywhere close, it just kind of pops, right? Like it just is effective in that way. We don't. In other words, like what we're measuring in this thing called Christian nationalism, it doesn't have to be calibrated so precisely to really show up on these surveys and to make big effect sizes. Like the kinds of associations that we're documenting with authoritarianism and anti-democratic values and violence. It really happens either way we try to measure it, so it doesn't depend so heavily on our measures. Also, ideological spectrums. We add these questions into a scale, and so they allow for latitude. We don't have let me put it this way, we don't have a clinical category called Christian nationalist. And a matter of fact, I don't like going around calling people Christian nationalists if I could. Why? Well, that's kind of like going around calling people a fascist. Like, it tends to shut down conversation, you know, like calling people a racist, right? Like, I can say those ideas are racist. Those ideas are redolent of fascist politics. That is, and say that ideology reflects Christian nationalist assumptions. But to go around calling people Christian nationalists as if that was a clinical category of people, I think is less effective. So I prefer to talk about it like it's a spectrum, that people can score high or low on the spectrum of Christian nationalism. Okay, so I'll just give you an example of what I'm talking about. This is a little scale that I'm showing here. Take one of the questions that we use is about prayer in public schools. The federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces. That's kind of vague, right? That could mean walking around with a cross on my neck, or that could mean a hijab, right? Like you might say, well, that's fine. That's perfect. That's perfectly fine. Or you might take that to mean crosses on state seals, or 10 Commandments in the courthouse, something that might be a little bit overtly religious or Christian or Judeo-Christian within a public space that you'd have a problem with. We found that the more Americans agree with these kinds of questions. Did I have a question? Sorry, I thought I heard somebody's voice. Okay, sorry. The more Americans agree with these, even the vague ones, the more they agree with very explicit measures, like the Constitution is divinely inspired, or the federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation. In other words, we find that even with these rather vague measures, Americans who take our surveys kind of know what we're getting at. They know we're getting at a culture war question. They know we're getting at this idea of like who America rightfully belongs to and whose symbols should have privilege in the public sphere. They're not necessarily, these people are, in other words, not thinking about Muslim hijabs or yarmulkes on their heads. They're thinking about crosses on state seals and those kinds of things. Okay, but we are more and more coming to the understanding that we can talk about Christian nationalism as an emerging identity, and in many ways, this is actually the scarier phenomenon. if it's not just a political theology. If it's a political theology, then we can actually work with clergy, we can work with groups, religious groups, to try to help adjust it, to go into their own scriptures and to say, you know what, the Bible doesn't necessarily teach that we have a special relationship with God as Americans, that this is problematic, that Jesus would like something else, you know, that maybe, you know, anti-democratic practices and taking away people's rights is not a Christ-like thing to do theologically. But if it's not a theology, if it's not a political theology, but if it's more about an identity that is impervious to any kind of facts that would challenge it, that it is primarily about us versus them and who we are as a people versus those bad guys, outsiders, which I think is we're actually getting to that point. Then it becomes something a little bit more impervious to facts, something that is impenetrable to truth. The more it solidifies, and I think that's actually what we're coming to. So remember this chart that I showed. This is not from our work. The tweets that exploded in June and July were not coming from us. The references to Christian nationalism. Anyone want to guess?
The investigation.
Oh, so it would be nice. That was actually happening around June, but where this come from was Marjorie Taylor Greene. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, in June, at the beginning of June, she goes online. She posts a video of herself saying, "We ought to be proud Christian nationalists. The Republican Party ought to be the party of Christian nationalists." And for June and July, she kept hitting that narrative. She was going to give talks, and she just said, like, hey, we ought to quit apologizing for this. We are Christian, we're nationalist, we're Christian nationalists, and it's nothing to be apologizing for. So it caused Twitter to explode. It caused this interest to go wild, and now all of a sudden this vaulted it. It wasn't sociologists like me. It was actually Marjorie Taylor Greene who kind of vaulted this into the national conversation, where this is something that people are now interested in, people are talking about, and this is something that is considered. But it came from somebody who was actually claiming it as an identity. In other words, before, and we really did find this. We've been writing about this for the last several years, and we have found that on the Christian right, the tendency was to either dismiss it as like, oh, that's not a thing, you guys just made that up, or to say, oh, that's just a slur, or to marginalize it. If it's a thing, yeah, maybe a thing that may be a few people, but it's marginal. We have only recently started to see leaders on the religious right and the political right start to embrace that term and to say, you know what, we're proud Christian nationalists. We will carry this. One of the reasons I was actually really excited to share the data with you today is it is the first survey, we're waiting to get back, where we actually ask Americans, would you identify as a Christian nationalist? It'll be the first, where we're able to establish a baseline. How many people are actually identifying with this label? And we can look at change over time and whether this is actually increasing or declining, and who is increasing it, who is it increasing for? Maybe I'll provide that with John as soon as we get it. I'm sure I'll write an op-ed like the day I get those data, because it'll be really important. But we actually find that this Marjorie Taylor Greene, just after this, started to trade on this label. She's selling shirts that say "Proud Christian Nationalist." And if you were if you had any curiosity whether this was kind of like, you know, hey, let's be Christ-like as Americans, she's got her dukes up, like right there in the picture. Like, this is what it's about. It's about culture war. It's about fighting the leftists. It's about it's almost embracing the deplorables label. That's almost what it is. Like, we are Christian nationalists, and that's what we're going to do. But it goes beyond Marjorie Taylor Greene. Within the past 2 months, I am sad to say the best-selling books on Christian nationalism are not my own 2 books. They are these 2 books, and these were both written within the last month and a half, and they are actually arguments from conservative Christians saying why we ought to be Christian nationalists. They're embracing the label, and they're saying it. And you could look on Amazon right now. They are outselling. Oh, sadly, they are outselling my own works on this. And so, though we get accused of like, oh, this is the leftist sociologist smear campaign to try to, you know, it's not coming from us. It's from inside the house, guys. Like, it is members now of the Christian right who are looking to leverage that rhetoric and to solidify an identity around this. Here's where it gets scary. What happens when this is no longer something that the idea that America is a Christian nation, that we ought to privilege Christianity, that we ought to put Christians in office? I mean, some of these people I know in particular, these folks right here, actually both of them, I've read part of this book and all of that book. I know for a fact that they actually would propose things like religious tests for public office, that they would want Christian leaders in office, that they would want, they would want to privilege Christianity legally in a way that would be, they would say is not discriminatory, but it's clearly, I don't know how you get around, it would discriminate, and unapologetically so. That's a problem, and it's especially a problem if more people start to act on behalf of that identity. We are Christian nationalists if they are proud of that, like they are proud of being Republicans or conservatives or that kind of thing. But we can also talk about Christian nationalism as a political strategy. Now, this is where we get a little bit confused, because I think people will often see the use of religious language by a politician, because people have been doing that for years and years and years. Like Donald Trump is not the first person to reference like Christian language in political discourse. Oh yeah, George Bush. I mean, we actually have a long history of this, but something has changed. So I don't want to say that this has always been with us. Something has indeed changed. Let me give you some data on how we know that. This was taken from a study by a scholar, communication scholar named Kerry Hughes. Kerry Hughes scraped. He got together all of the high state and minor state presidential addresses all the way from FDR to Donald Trump. And what he did was he coded up all the rhetoric. He went through this kind of with this analysis software, and he looked at God terms per 1,000 words and faith terms per 1,000 words. Both, in other words, explicitly Christian references and kind of vague generic religious references. And he looked at, okay, how often do presidents use that kind of language, this rate of God terms and faith terms per 1,000 words? And he found that this is, it actually doesn't vary a whole lot by political party. Here, you see, I'll just use an example, Obama and Reagan, right over here. They were both actually they used religious language about the same rate. But what happens when we include Trump in this? Right there at the top, right? Like so Donald Trump was far more likely, basically twice as likely as Reagan and Obama, who were already using it quite frequently, to be more likely to reference God terms and faith terms in their high state and minor state presidential addresses. But what kind of rhetoric was it? All right, it wasn't just the references to generic, shining city on a hill or some kind of like cryptic references to something that was actually quite explicit. Here this is Kerry Hughes, he also coded up the kinds of what words were collocated. In other words, like they were 10 words behind, 10 words before, in what associations with various kind of vocabulary were these religious words showing up. These are faith terms and speeches, tweets, God terms, and then religious terms are all of those put together. Now, you might be able to see that. I'll just highlight some right here. So when we look at the kinds of words that were showing up in these, we've got liberty in America, family America, nation, saluting, flag, America, America, liberty, flag, saluting. Like in other words, it is very frequently associated with the idea of who we are as a nation whenever Trump is referencing religious language, using that Christian language, always with flag, always with nation, always with America and who we are, and that is our identity. And he was explicit about it. He wouldn't say religion so much. He would say things like Christian. That was actually far more open and explicit about it. Now, you might see some other words that show up in there that seem out of place. You have to contextualize. How is he meaning these things? Thoughts, families, victims, attack. Families, victims, attack, terrorists, killed. Thoughts, families, attacks, victims. So what's going on there? Well, it's a different religion that he's referencing. This is his references. This is from another study where he's referencing how often Trump referenced Islam and how many words are collocated with his references to Islam. Now, whenever Trump references Islam, he almost always does so with these kinds of words showing up around it: radical, terrorist, terrorism, radical threat. Those kinds of words. And in fact, Trump is unique among all presidents. I'll show you another study right here. This is from communication scholars Newman and Gary. And they looked at, basically go back to Jimmy Carter, and they looked at how often and what kind of references were made to Islam by presidents going all the way back to Carter. Presidents usually didn't refer to Islam before Carter, and that started with like the Iran hostage crisis. And so we see that Trump stands alone in the fact that this is the percent of his discourse with violence present, right? Like, so he's different from every other president in that almost every time he referenced Islam, it was almost always within the context of violence. But how he referenced Islam's relationship to violence makes him stand apart completely, not just in terms of quantity, but in quality. This is the next study. Look how this flips. This has amazed me every time I see this. So every other president, from Carter to Obama, whenever they referenced Islam, they were far more likely to do so by saying that Islam is a religion that does not condone violence, that is a religion of peace, that stands against violence. Trump is the only president who, in 77% of his instances, every time he mentions Islam, he almost always does so in reference to Islam as a religion that condones violence, that facilitates it. That is consistent with one of his favorite phrases, radical Islamic terrorism. He said it again and again, and this is a constant trope. Radical Islamic terrorism, that he's protecting the country from radical Islamic terrorism. It should be no surprise that one of the strongest predictors of voting for Trump in 2016 was blatant Islamophobia, that you thought Muslim refugees were coming to the country, that they were terrorist threats, that they were going to do incredible harm to Americans. And Trump was able to trade on that kind of rhetoric. So what do we see so far? So we actually see Trump, among all presidents, stands alone in his frequency of religious references in his language, but his language is explicitly tied to God and country, this kind of folk Christian nationalism that we would reference, but also Islamophobia, almost juxtaposed, right? Like it is the contrast to Christian nationalism. That is, we are a Christian nation. We are a nation that stands for the kinds of things that he was talking about, the kind of words that he was using: flag, nation, families. And over here, he's talking about Islam and the threat and violence and the people that we want out. These are just some examples from Trump's rhetoric. This is from his first campaign. Think about the kind of language that he's using. Stuff that you cannot imagine. Stuff that you cannot imagine. Even George W. Bush post 9/11, whenever he referenced Islam, was usually within the context of talking about, like, hey, this is a religion of peace. They're not coming against Islam. Certainly, there's a war going on, so I don't mean to say that was not motivated by any kind of Islamophobia. And yet, that wasn't the kind of rhetoric coming from the very president himself. Trump talks about there is an assault on Christianity. There is an assault on everything we stand for. Who's he talking to? And we're going to stop the assault. He's making these promises that America is coming against you. There's a leftist plot coming against Christians. There's an assault. I'm going to stop that assault. We're going to be saying Merry Christmas again. Do you remember that time during Obama's presidency where it was illegal to say Merry Christmas? No, that didn't happen. Okay, so like that, and yet he was able to kind of trade on this trope of like, why don't we ever say Merry Christmas again? I'm going to be the champion of that. I'm going to say Merry Christmas again. He went on in that same campaign. He says, but we are going to protect Christianity. You look at the different places, in Christianity, it's under siege. Other religions, frankly, they're banding together. They're using it. Somehow we have to unify. We have to band together. Our country has to do that around Christianity. That is explicit Christian nationalism. Like, our country will unify, not around our common creeds, not around the founding principles and the Declaration, but we're going to band together around Christianity, the way other nations are doing that, around their religion. We'll be a religious nationalist country. Later in his 2020 campaign, this is his Evangelicals for Trump rally, and he's speaking. He says, a society without religion cannot prosper. A nation without faith cannot endure, because justice, goodness, and peace cannot prevail without the glory of Almighty God. I have no idea what that means at all. That is definition of word salad. But you can see that is the kind of rhetoric used to appeal to an audience that is looking for that, like, yes, my religion is important and we're going to fight for it. He goes on. As we speak, every Democratic candidate, everyone, is trying to punish religious believers and silence our churches and our pastors. Our opponents want to shut out God from the public square so they can impose their extreme anti-religious and socialist agenda on America. My administration will restore faith as the true foundation of American life. Explicitly Christian nationalist. This kind of rhetoric. Now, you can't say that is like, I get it. Like, people want to, we often get the response like, hey, is this really a new thing? White evangelicals have been kind of like doing this as Jerry Falwell. Like, this is not coming from presidents, y'all. Like, this is not coming from like up front. And Trump has since spawned multiple copycat Republicans who are now testing this kind of rhetoric in public, and they're trying to win their primaries by it, and they're trying to win governor elections, or hadn't you noticed? By that kind of thing. So I'll just give you an example of an experimental study that we have done recently to show how powerfully these things are linked together. What we did is we actually took a group of white Christians, white Christian Americans from Prime Panels. There's this kind of group that agrees to participate in these kinds of experimental studies. And what we did was we subjected them to an experimental condition. We gave them one of four conditions. Either they got no article to read, or they got one of three articles. They were told, they were given an article, a very brief paragraph, about discrimination against white Americans, discrimination against black Americans, or discrimination against Christians. And we wanted to see, okay, how they potentially responded to these stories in their thoughts about who actually gets mistreated in our country. And so our outcome was we looked at this multi-item scale of perceived discrimination against all of these groups. Here's what we found. This is pretty fascinating. So the long and the short of it is Americans who were told that Black Americans were discriminated against were more likely to think Black Americans are discriminated against. The conditions were doing exactly what we thought. If you got a story about white Americans being discriminated against, you thought white Americans were discriminated against. But here's where it gets interesting. The white Christians who were told that Christians are being discriminated against also thought white people were being discriminated against. And the group that were told people were discriminated against white Americans also thought Christians were being discriminated against. What's going on there? Well, it comes down to this idea that in America, in the United States, race and religion are, like Christianity, Christian identity, especially for white Americans, is fundamentally racialized. In other words, when they hear the language of Christian heritage, Christian values, Christian nation, they think people like me. And that includes people with my values, but it also includes people with my ethnic culture, probably people who look like me. Now, think about how important that is for the rhetoric that a president uses. Right? If what I've just told you is true, and that actually can be seen out in the general public, if me telling you as a white Christian audience about anti-Christian persecution makes you think about anti-white persecution as well, then I never have to mention race at all as a president, do I? I can just say Christianity is under siege. Our values are under attack. Our way of life is under attack. They're coming after Christians, and I can make you think anti-immigration. I can make you think anti-Black Lives Matter. I can make you think, whoa, Colin Kaepernick and NFL players kneeling. I can make you think about threats to white America by just talking about threats to Christian America. Do you see how clever that is, right? If that actually is transposable. And so Christian nationalism as a political strategy is not just about some kind of theology of who America belongs to as a Christian nation. It is about whiteness. It is about ethnocentrism. It is about so much more than religion, but it's also ethnicity as well. So what about the threat? So this, maybe you don't need to hear much more after that, but that was actually the good news, guys. Sorry. So no, just there are some more associations I just want to draw out here. We have sought to measure this in several different ways, and I'm just going to give you several data points, and this won't take too long because I think the charts kind of speak for themselves. This is from our book, or these are the kinds of, if you ever get a chance to read, The Flag and the Cross, which we had written recently. We use this Christian nationalism scale I told you about. We added up all those questions, and we said people who score higher or lower. So if you get a 28 or in this kind of area, you are a true believer, right? Like a Christian nationalist, for lack of a better word. And look at these trends. Now, I just want to, so this is actually after controlling. We control statistically for other factors. This is not, in other words, we control for political partisanship, education, income, region of the country. In other words, I'm not just showing you some proxy for being a Southerner or being an evangelical or going to church a lot. This is actually something isolated, okay? We find that as Christian nationalism increases, we actually see agreement with, say, authoritarian values. Things like the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Right? Have you heard that one before? The biggest problem with the death penalty is we don't use it often enough. That one right there. Think about that. Like that's at the highest end of Christian nationalism, our Christian nationalism scale. White Americans, over 70% of them would say, biggest problem with the death penalty is we don't use it enough. Right? Like that is a shocking correlation for me. Authorities should be able to use any means necessary in order to keep law and order. In national security is risk, I support the use of torture. All four of those, Christian nationalism is the strongest predictor. Not partisanship, not political ideology. It is the strongest predictor of these kinds of outcomes. What about anti-democratic tendencies? This is where we talk about elections. We asked Americans back in 2020 and 2021 various views about election fraud and election integrity. Three of these were actually asked before the 2020 election. So before there was any accusation, any big lie, any talk of a stolen election. We asked Americans if they would support hypothetical civics tests in order to vote. So we're basically seeding kind of Jim Crow type questions. How much would you agree with these? If they would revoke the voting rights of certain felons for life, lifelong felon disenfranchisement. And they thought we already make it too easy to vote. So we found as white Americans increase in Christian nationalism, they're more likely to affirm all of those. Civics tests, disenfranchisement, that we already make it too easy to vote. Again, this is before the 2020 election. We asked this in October 2020. No talk of a stolen election. This is already what they're thinking. In 2021, we asked Americans one question. It was an either or. Is voting a privilege or a right? Right? And you'd be glad to know most Americans think voting is a right. Right? That's a good thing. That's good news. But we find that as white Americans increase in Christian nationalism, they're more likely to say that voting is a privilege, not a right. In other words, it is not something that shall not be infringed. It is something that we can extend. It is something that we can take away. It is something that we can limit in some kind of way. And that is a disturbing conclusion, right? Like the more Americans sign on to this kind of ideology, the more likely they are to affirm that voting is something that is, people ought to be worthy of. People ought to deserve. And we can take it away from those who don't deserve it anymore. And this is where we get into violence, political violence. So we asked several questions. This is in August 2021, our survey that asked, basically we're asking QAnon questions there. If you guys have referenced QAnon, like some of these were kind of asking around QAnon questions, and we found that the more Americans subscribe to Christian nationalism, at the highest levels, almost 50%, or about 50%. They agreed to things like, there's a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders, and because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to physical violence in order to save our country. So think about a context in which this kind of rhetoric is becoming not only part of the ideology, but a part of your identity. This is who we are. This is what we believe. These are the kinds of things that we stand for, and we're not going to let the woke left take away these kinds of things from us. This is from our most recent survey in 2022. This is a problem for just moving forward democratically. So we asked Americans, which is more important? That we overcome our differences in order to solve our common problems. Hopefully something that we would all be willing to do, like we've got to be able to put aside. We've got climate change. We've got COVID. We have got all of these kinds of things that confront us as a nation. We've got to be able to compromise in some ways. We find that the more Americans subscribe to Christian nationalism, and I use two explicit questions here, declare a Christian nation, and when you think of an American, it's important to be a Christian to be a true American, right? Like you think the identities are the same. The more Americans subscribe to that, the more likely they say it's more important that we overcome our opponents who are leading our nation astray. So think about that. Like when you are confronting this kind of ideological identity in Christian nationalism, you are actually confronting something that is fundamentally about this us versus them dichotomy. In other words, compromise is no longer an option. It's not about overcoming differences. It's about overcoming our opponents. It's about overcoming our enemies and conquering whatever the cost. This is another one. This is thinking democratically. We asked Americans, is it more important that citizens freely exercise their democratic right to vote, or is it more important that the right candidate wins? Now, the point I'm trying to make here isn't that the majority of even staunch Christian nationalists believe that. Most Americans, as you can see, believe it's more important that the Americans exercise their democratic right. But the correlation is undeniable. As Americans more strongly agree with Christian nationalism, 40 to about a third % of those groups believe that, no, it's just more important that the right candidate is in office rather than people actually exercising their free democratic right. So pathways forward. And I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for hanging with me through this. Thinking about pathways forward, I'm willing to take any. This is my survey of you guys. If you have any, no, we do think about this a lot, and this is really important. And I have some ideas on the basis of what we are seeing, where we are seeing this comes from. As Christian nationalist ideology seems to be something that reacts to threat. One of my colleagues recently did an experimental study where they told a group of Christians that Christianity, they gave them one of these conditions in an experiment, and they told them that Christians were, by 2050, they were going to be the minority religion. In other words, they basically told them that, like, hey, you're going to lose your political and cultural power. They found that Christians who were told with that information, given that information, actually responded with greater Christian nationalism, and they responded with greater Trump support. So more likely to be Christian nationalists, more likely to get Trump support by telling them. In other words, Christian nationalism, as did Trump support, responds to threat. From above, right? Like it responds to kind of like being told you're under attack, there's a problem, you're going to be threatened. So, and what we're seeing now as we see books come out that identify with Christian nationalism, as we see Marjorie Taylor Greene call herself that, and more people embrace the label potentially, it becomes something that is, I think, more clearly affected by top-down rhetoric. That the rhetoric of elites, that is extremely problematic. That it responds to that if Trump or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert or Mastriano wins, doesn't look like he's going to, thank God, but like I think that's like you're going to see more candidates use that rhetoric and test it out, see if it works. you have the potential for this to solidify as an identity, become an even more problematic thing that continues to divide Americans. And so we are not seeing, this is the good news I wanted to point out, there is good news in this. We actually don't see a lot of evidence that Christian nationalism is growing in terms of a percentage of the population. That's good news. So this is a couple of data points from 2017 to 2022. We asked the same question, should America declare itself a Christian nation? That goes all the way down from about 30% to under 20%. This other one from various surveys from 2004, about almost 50% of Americans at that time believed that being a Christian was very important to being truly American. By 2014 and 2016, it goes down to about 30% or a little bit higher. And by 2020, when Pew asked that question one more time, it goes down to about 20%. It seems to be declining. But as this solidifies in terms of an identity, a top-down identity that elites are putting out there that as threat increases because it responds to those kinds of things, we see this potentially working itself out at the top, in other words, right? Like it's not about, in other words, this is where the anti-democratic impulses of Christian nationalist ideology come out and make themselves known, because it really isn't about holding the majority anymore. It's about being able to work around these kinds of problems of being a minority, a religious minority in a country that is at odds with your own values. How do you do that? Well, you rig the judiciary and you rig elections. And you undercut election integrity, you undercut the democratic process to be able to get your way all the time so that you don't have to get majorities anymore, right? And so if we're confronted with this problem that the general population is becoming less explicitly Christian nationalist, but politicians on the right are increasingly using Christian nationalist rhetoric to mobilize their base, what are our goals? And these are just some ideas. Our goal is, one, to make sure it's an unsuccessful campaign strategy. That those candidates find that doesn't work, that doesn't fly anymore. Like we come out hard against that and say like this is something we stand against. Those hopefully when those candidates lose, like for example Mastriano is likely going to lose in Pennsylvania, that we hang that around his neck and say like, and I don't mean in a violent way. I just mean like we tie up that rhetoric and say like, look, this is a referendum on that kind of rhetoric. That Americans, this is un-American. We don't respond well to that kind of thing. We don't want that kind of violation of religious freedom and that kind of talk. Goal 2 is defending democratic access that ensures majorities of Americans who oppose Christian nationalism choose their representatives. What does that mean? It means fighting against things like all of these laws that are obviously intended to try to make voting different. Yeah, voter suppression. Yeah, all of that. Which, as we talk about in the book, like Christian nationalism is associated with support for gerrymandering. It's associated with support for the electoral college versus the popular vote. Why? Well, because that stuff happens to work really well for those groups. And so, as we think about what are the dangers that we actually really need to get part of the fight against Christian nationalism is the fight to ensure that everybody has access to vote, because if majorities vote, that's a good thing. I don't know if you're familiar with the name Paul Weyrich. Paul Weyrich, co-founder of the Moral Majority. His most famous quote, he founded ALEC, he founded the what?
The more people vote, the less we win.
Right, exactly. I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in the election goes up as the voting populace goes down, right? He was giving away the ball game right there. This is co-founder of the Moral Majority. I mean, this is the ball game. We need to suppress the wrong people from voting. That happens to be probably young people, people of color, people who would be less likely to be able to take time out of their day or produce voter ID or those kinds of things. And so the more we can increase voter access, the more we can ensure that majorities of Americans are actually getting to the polls and being able to do this, the more we can actually fight this problem. And then lastly, defending democratic norms to ensure elected officials who are sympathetic to white Christian nationalism or beholden to the base cannot subvert democracy through, say, the courts, or other means. What we're actually seeing, I think in Trump ushered this in and normalized it in some degree, is to say, who cares what the majority thinks? I only care what my base thinks, right? And I only have to because that's all I need to be able to get into office. I don't have to do what politicians historically did, which is appeal to the base initially, and then come back to the middle and kind of try to be everybody's president, right? Like that was the MO. Now no longer, right? Like you could just kind of disregard everybody else. That's a problem. We actually need to push our elites to get back to this place where they actually don't feel comfortable subverting democratic norms, and they actually get punished for doing so. That may sound like fantasy, but I agree that is a long road. But I think that's kind of where we are right now. It's a difficult place. I don't deny that. I thank you for your time and being able to share some information with you. I'd love to take questions. I will just say, I'll get to you in a second. I will just say, as much as I've showed you today, this has been the air that I've breathed for the last 7 years, and so I'm full of info on this. I am dying. I have just given you the ice shavings of the iceberg of the information that is available on this, and so I'd love to hear any questions that you have. Thank you.
Are you optimistic?
All right, we're gonna do questions. I'll take a cue and I'll get you next. The reason we do this is to pass the microphone around, make sure that everybody can hear, and also gets into the recording, so that he's not answering a question that just comes out of the blue. If you're watching this later in life, it seems like it's just kind of random. So, if you would, you know the ground rules. If you have a brief question, make sure it's brief. Make sure it's a question. Here you go.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering if you could comment on two things. The first is, how is it that most of these folks can condone behaviors and support politicians who don't seem to exemplify Jesus Christ in the New Testament?
Yes.
And also, how is it that some of the evangelical pastors are now saying they're losing control of their flock, and the ones that have been ousted are admitting now that they were drawn to the power more than the religion?
Right. That's a great question. So this goes into, I think, something we were just talking about as a group around lunch. Within social sciences and political science and sociology in particular, there's emerged within the last 2 decades, I think, consistent research that Americans are now adjusting their religion to fit their politics rather than the reverse. Historically, it might have been the case that Americans were choosing their political parties and their political values on the basis of the kinds of religious beliefs that they have held. It seems more so the case now that Americans are choosing their political party or their ideological identity, conservative, liberal, their tribe. And then they are choosing their religious community and religious values and religious beliefs and their ethics to suit their political goals. And so what that means is your partisan identity, your tribal identity is actually the first and most important thing in how you evaluate anybody religiously. I'll give you an example of that. Pew actually, I've got a study cooking in the hopper right now. We're waiting, it's under peer review right now. Pew Research Center done these large mega surveys where they asked Americans how religious they thought certain politicians were. How religious do you think Donald Trump is? How religious do you think Joe Biden is or Mike Pence? Now, objectively speaking, like if we're going to go by traditional measures of who is religious and who is not, how often you attend services, whether you actually believe the things that your religion says, Donald Trump is objectively not a very religious person. Certainly not as religious as a Joe Biden, who is a lifelong churchgoer. He talks about his religion very freely, is knowledgeable about it. The strongest predictor of how religious you thought Donald Trump was just partisanship, was your party. If you were a Republican, you thought Donald Trump was very religious. Why? Well, because he's your guy. He represents, that just represents you. That represents your group. And also Christian nationalism is the second strongest predictor. Why? Well, because Donald Trump fights for us, right? He's on behalf. So in other words, if they're a member of your group, that by default makes them good and moral and religious. Not whether they go to church, not whether they believe the actual orthodox beliefs of your religion. It's whether they are like you, whether they're a part of your team. Identity comes first. Tribal identity comes first, and all that kind of theology comes second. It gets subordinated to that. Now, what we're actually seeing at the church level, and I'm still very much connected with religious communities in Norman. That's kind of where we are. I mean, it is Chick-fil-A world. I tell people living in Norman is like living in a gigantic Chick-fil-A, and when I say Chick-fil-A, I mean that complimentary because the rest of Oklahoma is like a MAGA rally. So it's like if a MAGA rally became a state, and then they put a Chick-fil-A in the middle of it, and that's Norman. It happens to be kind of the nice, clean, friendly place inside of what is otherwise a MAGA rally. So I'm very much steeped in that culture and community still, and I talk to a lot of pastors, I talk to a lot of religious leaders in that area, and since 2020, it has been a common conversation for them to say the last several years have been a time of sorting, where people came to us because we mentioned George Floyd, or Black Lives Matter, or white supremacy, and they said, you guys have gone woke, we're out of here, and we're going to another church. Or you didn't come out for Trump or life or pro-life or that kind of thing, and so we're out of here. You guys are always obviously liberal. That other times it's been on the opposite end. Like you didn't say anything about George Floyd, and therefore you guys are part of the MAGA nation now, and we're going to go someplace else. And so what's happening is churches are sorting at the level of political identity rather than religion. Like these people believe the same things theologically, and yet they fall on different lines politically and culturally. And so they are actually, you're getting more homogenous churches. So pastors are losing their churches primarily because of politics now, rather than theological disagreements. Now, that's always happened to some degree, but I think it's accelerated now because of the situation that we find ourselves in.
If you've been dealing with this for 10 years or so, are you optimistic? Because I'm trying to be optimistic.
Yes. I think the data that I showed you a second ago, I think makes me more optimistic. Oops. Can we go back? Oh, no, I'm not. Let's see. Hold on a second. Let me click on this. Let's say, okay, hold on a second. Did I go? Oh, there we are. Okay. I think that these kind of data make me optimistic that like Americans are. I think Americans aren't buying it in general, right? Like you've got a lot of Americans who are reacting to this thing in some negative ways. Here's actually what I think is going on at the survey level. So we're watching this unfold in real time. And as we saw, like the Family Research Council just did a kind of like a public thing where you've got like Michelle Bachmann and Tony Perkins talking about the work that we've done. Like they're reacting to it. Marjorie Taylor Greene is reacting to it. So the language is changing. Americans see this conversation. And I think you've got a lot of Americans who are backing away from it, saying like, you know what, if that's what I would have agreed to 10 years ago, count me out, right? Like that, it's becoming associated with racism and nationalism and things that are negative. And I think that's a positive development. I want that to happen because it is connected to those things. So I'm optimistic in the sense that I think a large percentage of Americans aren't buying it, and I think they're backing away from it. I think what makes me cautious about that, though, is one, Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism responds to threat. And so all you need a kind of a well-timed and charismatic politician to be able to rally that anger and fear and anxiety to be able to kind of mobilize victories. And I think we've also seen how much damage one candidate can do if they're able to kind of co-opt the judiciaries and change some election laws and that kind of thing. When it becomes a problem is when you no longer need majorities to win, right? Like you've been able to gerrymander, you've been able to rig certain things to where you have seen the writing on the wall that my tribe is shrinking. And so what do? Well, I don't want to change, and I don't want to change my values. Like, remember in 2012 when the Republicans lost to Obama again, and they do this autopsy? They literally called it an autopsy. Like, they do this autopsy where their conclusion in that autopsy is like, hey, we need to open ourselves up. Like, we need to make sure everybody knows we're an inclusive party. We need to make sure that immigrants know, that like people of color know that we're the party for them. And then, they actually have campaign strategists a couple years later that says, we don't need to do that at all. What we need to do is we just need to rile up the base. We need to make them angry and fearful and get that anxiety, get the populist movement going. They found that in Trump, and he was able to run on a very like explicitly us versus them, xenophobic, Islamophobic kind of campaign. And he was able to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. He was able to get his Supreme Court justices. He was able to appoint tons of federal judges. And with that, he was able to make sure that he still has power even when the majorities are just nowhere in sight. I mean, Republicans haven't won they won one popular vote, Bush in 2004, since Clinton, right? Like in decades, they've only won the popular vote one time. They don't need it if they can just kind of like work the system. So I think I am cautious about my optimism in that Americans do seem to be moving leftward on this issue, and yet at the same time, it just takes a really motivated and smart, savvy group of like strategists to subvert all of that. And so we need to be kind of wise about how we navigate, how we counterattack that kind of movement.
I've got a question here, and then I'll zing back around.
Before we leave that, can I ask real quickly, would you say intensity, while the population is smaller, I think the intensity is much greater?
Yes, radicalized and militant would be the words that I use. So like as a group shrinks, and they know they're shrinking, they become more militant and more radicalized, which makes them more dangerous in some ways. They're not lazy, they're motivated. They know their days are numbered unless they can get serious about it. And every study that comes out and says, hey, Christians are shrinking and this is kind of a we're secularizing as a country, feeds more fuel. It doesn't discourage them and say, oh, I guess we better give up and just go along to get along. It makes them say, no, like we need to like fight. Because this persecution complex that like say white conservative Christians have, they have this persecution. Like, I mean, on all of our surveys, they believe they are the #1 most discriminated against group in the United States. Like truly, like more than any other group, they believe they are the most discriminated against, persecuted group in the United States. Now, if they really believe that, if it's not just, I mean, they're taking surveys by themselves. It's not like they have to lie to anybody. Like they really do believe that. But if they believe that, that's a motivated group, and they're motivated to defend their own privileges in that way.
Sam, thanks for sharing
Sure.
your data with us. I'm really interested in the responses to this, and I find it very interesting that like Green has actually adopted this Christian nationalism. Have you discovered for people on, say, politicians and Christian leaders who find this a threat, have they adopted this language and are pointing out and saying there's a threat and it's called white Christian nationalism? Are they using it in the same way? Are they identifying it? Are they, you understand what I'm saying here? Like,
Right.
Are people opposing this using the same kind of terminology?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's kind of solidified. I mean, the last several years have kind of like put a label on what exactly we're talking about. And I one of the problems we are trying to solve here in trying to be clear about how we use this language is I do think as the term becomes more popular, I don't want this to be the left's version of like woke. Does that make sense? Like, you know, like the right throws around like this meaningless term woke, right? Like woke, and it's a dog whistle, it's a racial dog whistle. It implies all of these things, but it's used kind of like, it's a slur. It's just a slur to say liberal, leftist, like you add it on to everything, like woke gender ideology, woke racial ideology, woke everything. It's the woke left, trademark. That was who was Evan. Evan, you said that. Yeah. So that's so I think you've got I don't want Christian nationalism to be the left's version of woke. It's this kind of like slur that we say about everything that is kind of smacks of like religion or something like that, or religion and politics. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about Christians voting their values, whatever that means. I'm not talking about like people like, to some degree, I'm a scholar of religion. I don't really believe we can so clearly divorce our religious values and morals from like our politics. I do think that that's not really happening, but Christian nationalism is not that. Christian nationalism is fundamentally a claim about who America rightfully belongs to, who it's always belonged to, who it should belong to, how we ought to institutionalize that identity. That's not Christians voting their values, unless your value happens to be fascism. Like that's like, if your value is fascism, then like no, you don't get to vote your value. They're like it's you know like or we will counteract that kind of like movement. So yes, I do think people are embracing that language, both people for and against it. Probably more people against it than for it. It has been a recent thing that people for it have actually started to embrace it rather than marginalize it or dismiss it or that kind of thing. And even some still do, like Mastriano, for example. He doesn't let himself get cornered by that. People ask him directly, are you a Christian nationalist? And he goes more like, what does that even mean? That's a leftist slur. That's just something you guys call people. Even though if anybody is a Christian nationalist, it would be like Mastriano. But I think we're trying to fight the slipperiness of that, so where it's not just kind of this thing that gets bandied about and becomes meaningless. We want to define it carefully.
Well, how do you break through? You're optimistic.
Hold on just a second. Let me get for your. We had a cue, but go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Cautiously
Thank you.
optimistic.
Sorry about that. You're cautiously optimistic, and I'd like to get on that train. But when I see that not having the majority doesn't mean you're not in power.
Right.
And then you see the breakdown of these state legislatures that have passed in these laws that can invalidate votes.
All right.
I don't know how do we break through that? Because then it may be that the minority is really in control just because of the way the states break down electorally and vote-wise. So whereas you're cautiously optimistic, I want to know, how do we counter that?
So maybe it is naive of me. Maybe it is naive of me to think that that if I mean You're right. It's completely problematic. The kinds of moves that we're seeing to be able to set up laws in place as to where like state legislatures could nullify elections and nullify results that they don't like or that don't land in their area. I'd like to think that Americans in those states, especially if they actually do win the majorities of the votes in those states, would be so up in arms about such an egregious violation of the democratic process that they. I mean, but that's where it gets ugly, right? Like that's where people take to the streets. That's where it gets like, I mean, I think really, hopefully those politicians care about their own. I don't mean physical safety. I just mean like their own obligations to their job and their own integrity there. I mean, we did see some like as much as the 2020 election as discouraging as that was and I'm in Oklahoma, guys. Like we called the election for Trump 3 minutes after polls closed. Like it wasn't even a question. Like it was just, like it wasn't. I mean, these are just kind of like ritual at that point that we go through. But you did see. I mean, you had Trump appointed, and Trump-backed candidates like in Georgia, for example, like Raffensperger and those kinds of guys, like say, like, hey, I can't do this. Like, I mean, they actually stuck to their guns. They had integrity enough to say, like, we're not gonna do this. One can only hope that they see their own political future in that and want self-preservation. And again, I'm not talking about violence. I'm talking about just political self-preservation there enough, but all we can do is hope. I think the most discouraging thing over the last time, I was talking to several other folks about this, one of the most discouraging things about the last few years, Trump's whole presidency, was every month, I think, he would do something, and I would say, surely that was illegal, right? Like, surely that was like, can he do that? Like, and it turns out like it's all just kind of democratic norms. There's no laws. Like, it's not like it turns out like presidents have been so kind of like good at conforming to like presidential norms of behavior, Republican and Democrat, that Trump willfully just trounced all over those things so often because he just knew like these are just norms. Like I don't have to do any of this. I can just kind of violate. I can lie all the time. I can lie all the time, and that's not illegal. Like it's not illegal for a president to just lie blatantly. Right. But it's like and still it's like he's still bulletproof. Like he's still running around. So I think it becomes this thing where it's like to what extent do we actually hold politicians accountable for their crimes? And I mean, you just got to hope that Trump pays the price eventually because he's still leading the polls pretty far ahead of like DeSantis.
Before we go to our next question, I just wanted to comment. We've been looking at some situations here in Arizona with a number of officials here. Tracy and I are working on an op-ed. I hope you'll be able to read it soon in the Republic. It is interesting to see that there are some folks who have held the line, and as we think now today, this is perhaps the last public hearing of the January 6th committee. One of the more memorable moments came when Rusty Bowers went before the January 6th committee and said, very interestingly, that he believed that the Constitution was divinely inspired. He checked that block on the Christian nationalist poll, and that's what prevented him from voting and supporting the president's call to overturn the election. So these views can go different ways. Not everything is indicative of something else, and perhaps there's also that kind of hopeful possibility. Of course, he was just voted out of office because he didn't win his primary. Okay, Judith, you got the next question.
But don't you think that the horse has been out of the barn for a long time? Because presidents have had to sort of appear at church once they became inaugurated, and you had to be a Christian. You have to be Christian to be a president or a vice president. Yeah. So I do think there is a long history of especially presidential candidates having to tie themselves to religion in some way, or at the very least demonstrate that they are pro-religion. Because America's a religious nation still. Like we still are, the majority of us are still religion. You couldn't be an atheist. No, that would be heavily, even now, it's a stigmatized, it's something, right. So we have this kind of, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to use explicitly Christian nationalist rhetoric. It's a difference between what we call Christian nationalism and American civil religion. So American civil religion is this language that we kind of like have, and in some ways it's not a bad thing. Like I mean compared to what we're looking at with Christian nationalism, like civil religious rhetoric was usually used, and you can see this like in presidential inaugural addresses. They often make references to God, but if you look at like how they're using references to God or whatever,
it's often talking about like the obligations that we have to be like a just and equitable society, like that we have to be good stewards, that we have to be the kind of nation that is worthy of the kinds of resources and blessings that we've gotten. Those are all kind of, I mean, the intent is to unify us, right, rather than divide us in that rhetoric. So while the use of like religious rhetoric among kind of political leaders is quite common, I think what we're seeing now is I think the explicit leveraging of us versus them rhetoric, Christians versus everybody else, persecution, kind of discourse that is not civil religion. It's not for the sake of unity. It's about like fighting off enemies, political opponents now.
But I think as a minority, those of us who are minorities have been able to see more clearly how this has become an institutionalized part of the United States, of our
That's true.
politics.
No, the religious rhetoric has been. That's part of it. Yeah. There's a book by communication scholars, political communication scholars, Domke, D-O-M-K-E, and Coe, C-O-E, called The God Strategy. How like basically it's kind of like they study all of like religious rhetoric in American politics, and they kind of this is kind of the language that I'm using is the language they pick up on. It's this kind of like civil religious discourse.
And Sam's co-author, Phil Gorski, has spoken here at the center before. Hopefully some of you had a chance to see him when he was here. If not, you can find his lecture on our website.
Great.
It is very warm in here. We're going to have one more question, and then we're going to move on out to the reception area where we can partake of some fresh water and cookies. So you get the last question.
Oh, wow, exciting. Thank you so much for speaking. My question was more of a what do we do now, kind of going off of that. As you kind of talked about, and what I've heard just in discourse around for a long time, is one of the best ways to change people's minds is to be friends and to really engage in important dialogue like this. My question, though, is at what point are you enabling these kind of beliefs by continuing relationships with people and really giving people an ear and an empathetic ear in a lot of ways? But on the flip side, on the other side, at what point are you really continuing important discourse? Like, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think we actually ought to build relationships across these kinds of like dividing lines. Not like and I'm not saying like go befriend a white nationalist. You know, like see what they have to offer. You know, like I'm not saying that. Like I don't want to enable that. Like I don't want there to be any acknowledgement of a place for that kind of like rhetoric and ideology in society. At the same time, what I've described for you is a spectrum. Right, like you've got Americans who could be lured into that kind of like identity and tribe if they get a push from ugly people, right? Like ourselves. It's frustrating. I'm gonna go ahead and tell you, like it is frustrating to fight this and have to commit to always being the adult in the room. Like it is, right? Like it is to say we will do democracy right. We will not use violence, we will not threaten people, we will not kind of like go out and subvert norms or processes that like include the rights of everybody else to disagree. It's hard to be the adult in the room, so I'm going to say that. At the same time, like I don't think we have to make hard and fast rules about like who we will and won't kind of engage with. I think it's actually important for us to engage in these conversations in good faith, and I mean like relationships. I think one of the worst things that has happened to us in the last decade is, and this is political science books have been written about this, like the nationalization of all politics, to where the guy running for city commissioner in Norman has to come to my door and tell me he's pro-life. Well, why? What are you going to do? Like that's like, why did you say that? Well, you're just trying to identify with like a partisan tribe at that point. Like you just wanted to like. Right, it's all communicating that I'm a Republican city commissioner. What are you going to do? Like, I just want to know what you want to like your values. So, but what that means is all of our politics, all of our local politics, is just about national politics now. I think that's a disaster because like so much of politics is local politics, right? Like so, the more we get involved in local politics, the more exactly the more we take our eyes off of like the political show and theater, while at the same time confronting those politicians and making sure that they don't win and getting out and participating in democracy, but I mean really participating in democracy, getting involved in local politics, being active in that way, so that we're actually building coalitions with real people who may disagree with us slightly on a lot of political issues, but we agree on school board stuff. We agree on that bond issue. We agree on those kinds of things.
School boards were very...
Are torn apart by these kinds of things. Well, and I say that with CRT kind of scare stuff, yeah.
I'm afraid we actually need to call it to a close here.
Okay.
But I know Professor Perry to be a very generous soul. He might take your
Thank you.
questions afterwards. Please thank you. Join me in thanking him.